really excited to learn more about your story, what I've researched about you and read about you. It's going to, I know, inspire our audience. So let's start with your background in modeling, why you wanted to go into that field, and then how you had to change how you think about your physical appearance after the diagnosis.
Well, it's a very long story and I'll try to be as brief as possible, but I did start modeling at 11. And to go back into that 11-year-old brain and try to figure out exactly why, I can only imagine it was to get attention. And I was very pretty and people would say to me, "Oh, you should model." And so I was kind of encouraged to be in that industry other than from my own family. They did not want to be in me to be in the industry. And I had to really make an argument as to why I wanted to be in the industry to my own parents who had three other daughters. And so I would say to my parents, I really want to have my own income. And of course, I mean, I'm 11, but ultimately they said yes. And that's when I started modeling, which, by the way, turned into a very long career. In fact, I still do it. I've been modeling for 40 years. Now, of course, I flipped the switch and I do look at it differently. And I only went back to modeling in the past 3 years. So I was diagnosed with breast cancer in 2012, but I never woke up from any of my surgeries without something on my chest. I had implants, I had expanders, and then several times I had reconstruction. But it wasn't until 2020 where I had a MRSA infection in my implant and ultimately lost my chest and then became concave. So people assume a lot that I became concave or a flat chest when I had breast cancer, and I actually didn't.
So when you got the diagnosis, and
Yes.
and one of the things that has to change during the procedures and all that entails in the healing process is your relationship with your breasts. They're no longer, they've betrayed
Right.
you. I said that in the intro. How did you mentally deal with that? Something that had been important to your career.
Well, I didn't deal with it very well. I mean, I really did go into this victim mentality of why me? I'm allergic to sugar. I work out every day. I don't have the gene. How could this possibly happen to me? And it was that victim mentality that caused me a lot of duress and emotional pain. It doesn't matter that I worked out every day. It doesn't matter that I was allergic to sugar. It can happen to anybody. And I happen to have dense breasts, which we're finding out is you can be more susceptible and to breast cancer and also to hiding it. Because when you have dense breasts, it's harder to find it. So, but I didn't know any of those things. And of course, because I was so dependent on my external value for most of my life, I didn't know anything different. So I thought that what I brought to the table was my beauty. And without my beauty, I was worthless. And so it wasn't until months going through, I had 28 rounds of chemo. So I had chemo for 15 months. And I tell people all the time, I needed that 15 months to really change my brain because how do you go from 40 years believing that, the bag you chose to buy and saved up for was not your measure anymore? The hair on your head was not your measure anymore, right? Those things, it takes time to change that tape in your head. And so when my measure ultimately changed and I had faith and self-love and self-care, and I would look at a picture of myself every day and go, I'm going to protect you. It came from a different voice inside, a different tape inside that I had to spend months introspectively working on. But listen, I mean, I will tell you that not most, a lot of people that go through this type of transformation, they don't turn out as, I don't want to say unscathed. Of course, I've been scathed, but as optimistic. A lot of times when women, or in general, when people go through trauma, it creates a lot of emotional paralysis because we get stuck in this why me and this emotional trauma is hard to adjust to, right? And so when I talk about needing that 15 months, I would literally be on the bathroom floor after chemotherapy, throwing up many times and saying to myself, okay, we did this wrong. I did this wrong for so many years. How can I change it? And at that time, it was almost impossible to understand how I could possibly change it because I had just had a fused arm. So I was trying to figure out how I was going to live the rest of my life with my right arm fused. And I had a lumpectomy, so I couldn't use either arm. The only way I could drink a sip of water was by somebody feeding me. And so I went from being this courageous and very independent woman to being constantly needing care from other people, which was a whole new, another emotional duress, right? I mean, the only time that I could eat food was in a bathtub filled with water and somebody feeding me for the first 2 months of my chemotherapy.
That's
And I was,
humbling.
oh, I mean, talk about, you got to get rid of your pride and ego immediately. And if you don't, there's no way out. If I had said to my friends and family, oh, I'm not worthy of your time and attention, which by the way was my initial reaction, how was I going to take care of myself? So we literally have to come down to none of this stuff matters. None of the materialism, none of the toys, none of the cars, not the address, none of that matters. Okay, what is the basic thing that matters? Self-care, for one, because you have to have courage to get through the day. Self-love, because if I don't believe in myself, who would? And then I had to rebuild that, right? And it wasn't based on my external value because my measures changed. My faith mattered more to me than my Birkin bag.
And you said something that I have actually never heard anyone say together. Specifically, I haven't heard anyone on this podcast say it. When you go through a cancer diagnosis and the reconstruction, not just physically, but the reconstruction mentally and all of the different kinds of reconstruction you did, you called it trauma. Now, 20 years ago, I don't think that someone would say that a cancer diagnosis was a trauma in the way that most people think about trauma. And I love that you said it that way. Can you talk more and unpack that for people? Because certainly there are many, and I would say almost everyone listening has been touched by cancer in some form or fashion. And breast cancer is something that hits so many families specifically.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the trauma part of that, because that might be new for folks.
Well, if you think about it, right, for 41 years, I lived a certain way. I had a certain standard of what I was going to wake up and do, right? And the next day, right, I'm diagnosed with breast cancer. My days moving forward will never be the same, ever again. Mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, never again. So I had to build a new house, right, with a different picket fence because it wasn't a white picket fence anymore in the illness world. And that's trauma. And then after the chemotherapy, I had to build a new house, which wasn't like the house before the illness because that house was gone, right? Now my breasts are gone. Now my hair is gone. Now I'm trying to grow my hair back. Now I'm trying to figure out who I am. So the trauma, the duress, the panic, the emotional duress is so great. And I had the luxury of having a great amount of women champion for me and I had family. Imagine the trauma that people go through that don't have that. And so, which is really the reason why I'm here, because what I said to myself was, man, if all these women are showing up for me, why am I not showing up for me in this way, in this kind of kindness to yourself? And the other thing that I love to talk about is we don't live in a world of transaction. We don't have to. So often in the modeling space, even today, because I'm still in it, you know, photographers will say, well, if you do this for me, I'll do this for you. And that's how I thought that the world worked. And once I was diagnosed with cancer and I came out of it, I said to myself, I'm not living a transactional life anymore. If somebody asks me for a favor, I'm freely and willingly going to give it to them. If it's you know, safe for me, whatever. And if somebody says to me, will you do this for your mom? I'm like, okay, no problem. And they say, well, I can do this for you. I was like, no. I don't want to live in a transactional world because that immediately clips your self-esteem day after day after day because you think you have to do something for somebody else for a favor. That's not true. So we have to go back to the basic level again of self-love. How do you keep that?
And make that part of who you are every day, you want to make it a habit.
It's not
right?
a part-time job.
Mm-hmm. It's like part of your DNA.